When the Ford Motor Company announced plans for its new electric car plant in San Luis Potosi, José Puebla and his fellow construction workers were promised contracts. José immediately invested $18,000 in a new truck and more laborers. Things were looking up. But barely 6 months later, at the behest of US President-elect Donald Trump, the factory was cancelled. Ford's $1.5 billion investment was gone, and José no longer knew how he'd provide for his wife and 6 children.
It has been a great shock to our local community. Everyone had plans of how they would benefit economically from the plant, working on the assembly line, building the structure, opening restaurants alongside. It has left me in a lot of financial trouble.
Ford said its decision to pull out of Mexico was to show a willingness to work with President Trump, and the factory now cuts a lonely figure on the arid plains of the mid-Mexican state. As Ford's new electric car plant is abandoned here in San Luis Potosi, its replacement will be built in Michigan. That will score political points for President Trump, but it will also shake the foundations of a long-standing industrial relationship between Mexico and the United States.
I think Donald Trump is very bad news for Mexican business. We have started looking abroad for other industry partners because we can no longer depend on our relationship with the US.
As well as threatening US companies doing business in Mexico with higher import taxes, President Trump has also repeatedly threatened to tear up the North American Free Trade Agreement, which originally brought American industry into Mexico.
NAFTA has been a terrible deal, a total disaster for the United States from its inception.
Yet other companies already working in Mexico have not shied away from doing business in San Luis Potosi, and the mayor of Villa de Reyes says his town will bounce back.
We are an ideal place for manufacture. We have a hard-working populace, the state is flat, and logistically easy since we are just 6 hours from the US border. If Ford want to come back in 4 years, they will be received with open arms.
In the meantime, faced with unemployment, people like José and his family will go where they can find work, which they say may mean illegal immigration into the United States. Alasdair Baverstock, TRT World, San Luis Potosi.
For more on this, James Henry joins me now live from New York. He's an economist and senior fellow at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. James, thank you ever so much for joining us here on Money Talks. Let me start by asking you, what effect would pulling out of NAFTA would it have on the US, Mexico and Canada?
Well, I think it would have a pretty dramatic effect. I mean, NAFTA is 23 years old. It's had pluses and minuses. It probably does need a renegotiation because, you know, it leaves out things like e-commerce, which didn't really exist in the 90s. But there's no question that Mexico and Canada are the U.S.'s 2 largest trade partners next to China, and more than $1 trillion of exports. So there's a lot of winners and losers on all sides of the border if, you know, there was a dramatic rupture. And I think Trump just this week has reversed himself on NAFTA and kind of faced the facts. You know, his big contribution to global warming is a lot of hot air about NAFTA because he's trying to please his supporters. But the reality is that, you know, in the case of Canada, there's a relatively small trade deficit with Canada, about $5 billion a month. We have, on the other hand, a services surplus with Canada because we sell a lot of travel services and financial services and transportation services to Canada. So, you know, the same thing is in the case of Mexico. The Mexican stock market has actually appreciated substantially since Trump's election, you know, which leads a lot of people to suspect, you know, every time he denounces NAFTA, the peso drops, and there's increased competition from Mexico. So,
yeah. It actually makes it easier for Mexican companies to export, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Indeed.
So this is going to require, and I think the president is recognizing this, you know, first step is for him to actually get a trade negotiator in his job. That post still remains unfilled. Yeah. And then he has to announce new negotiations with both Canada and Mexico. He has to give Congress 90 days notice of that. And then, we can begin to dig into the details. But this is a very gory kind of exercise. It's not something that can be done with grand solutions.
Indeed. James, let me just read out a couple of the tweets that Donald Trump has put out on this. He says, I received calls from the President of Mexico and the Prime Minister of Canada asking to renegotiate NAFTA rather than terminate. I agreed. And he also says, subject to the fact that if we do not reach a fair deal for all, we will then terminate NAFTA. Relationships are good, deal very possible. Now, Trump and his Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross, claim that Mexico and Canada unfairly subsidize exports to the US. Are they right?
No, I don't think they're right. I think there's, there are individual cases like the Canadian dairy subsidies. The United States also subsidizes dairy farmers. In the case of softwood lumber exports, we saw Trump add a 15% tariff. This is a case that's going to be very unpopular with U.S. builders who have to buy their lumber from Canada. Where are they going to get it? So that's going to result in a lot of political protests in Washington. So this is a very complicated kind of menu that he's undertaken here, and there's no simple. There are areas like
James Henry. I'm really sorry we're running out of time. Would love to speak on this some more in the future. James Henry there from the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment.